Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We're just going to give folks a few more minutes to hop on, and then we'll get started. All right, just one more moment. We'll get started. All right, welcome everybody. I think we can get started now and a few more people might join. My name is Dana Harris. I'm the Manager of Policy and Advocacy at Generation Citizen. Want to welcome you all to the Action Civics Landscape webinar. It's been a really exciting project to work on, and we're really thrilled to be sharing it with everybody today. I just want to introduce the folks I'm here with today. We've got Janet Tran, who's the Director of Learning and Leadership at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation Institute, Abby Kisa, who's the Director of Impact at Circle, and my colleague Andrew Wilkes, who's the Director of Policy and Advocacy here at Generation Citizen. Just a few notes of housekeeping before we get started. You all are welcome to use video. We will not be using video. If you want to hide your video, feel free. Everybody came in muted, and please stay muted throughout the webinar. If you have any questions or comments throughout the webinar, you can chat them in the chat box. In the upper right-hand side of your corner, you'll see that you can click chat. Make sure that everybody is listed as who you're sending it to, and send your questions there. We also have a feedback form that I'll send the link to momentarily, and if you've got any very specific notes you have about any feature or something that doesn't necessarily make sense to discuss but you want us to know about, you can fill out that feedback form either now or later, and we'll circulate it again. And otherwise, let's get started. Andrew, you want to say a little welcome on behalf of Generation Citizen?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dana. So definitely want to begin by thanking Dana as well as Abby at Circle and Janet at the Reagan Foundation for all of the incredible work and effort that went into the landscape analysis. As many of us know, this is a time when we're witnessing a resurgence of entrance as well as interest in the civic space. And in order to navigate the space effectively and efficiently, we first need to map the territory and to understand who's doing what and to properly visualize who some of those players are. And so in just a few moments, we'll hear about how the landscape analysis aids us in that work. And I, like many of you, are excited to see the walkthrough of this process. So again, welcome on behalf of Generation Citizen, as well as I should also say Circle and the Reagan Foundation, and looking forward to the webinar.
Thanks, Andrew. Janet, if you want to give a little background on the project and then dive into it.
Absolutely. First, I want to thank everyone. It's been such a privilege to work on this project and learn a lot. In the meanwhile, working alongside Abby and Dana, discovering what the civic threads are that connect us as providers of civic learning, whether it's Action Civics or whether we're allies to it or whether we are merely interested in, on the periphery. I think we have a greater understanding of what the landscape looks like and how we can potentially collaborate. In front of you is one definition, an operational definition of what Action Civics is from the National Action Civics Collaborative, which is a student-centered project-based approach to civics education that develops the individual skills, knowledge, and disposition necessary for 21st century democratic practice. And we put this up here because it is one operational definition, but we wanted to use it. I want to kind of take a rewind to when we convened at the first time at the Ford Foundation, and those of you who were working on the research piece or the research team back in the day probably won't recognize the iteration of what we show you, because we worked from bibliography to potentially sketches for white papers and journals. And I think one piece that we spoke about that remains true is that we wanted to make sure that we put our time into something that moved theory to practice and something that would be useful to practitioners, to the field as a whole, and how this project evolved from the folks who were continuing and willing to continue the conversation after the second convening and willing to continue to deep dive was we eventually decided we wanted to offer an understanding of the field and that we needed to be a little more organized. So we decided to start with Action Civics, a small corner of the field, but largely emerging, considering pedagogy is more student-centered and aligns more to what we know about learning sciences and effective teaching. So what we're looking at is an overview of the map. And for those of you who are very interested in nodes and connections, this is entirely your jam or something that is very exciting. For those of you who may not be as familiar, don't be alarmed. We will have a little bit of a walkthrough, so this isn't just a bunch of confusing buttons that are showing up on your screen. So our vision is to understand a part of the field of the civic engagement and civic learning landscape. The product that we wanted to be outside of the white paper focus and have a little more of a visual feel. We said an infographic at first, but as we started talking about a map, we became very focused on the fact that we could understand where the organizations were that could empower these educators. We could understand which elements of Action Civics are actually being delivered. And then, of course, we could potentially serve as a resource to help us as these providers be more effective in collaboration. We want to, the largest disclaimer in this project early on was the fact that we needed to use data, and we'll talk a little bit more about the methodology, that was not from individuals, but instead from something we could collect in a qualitative and quantitative manner. And we decided on the websites, and we've learned a lot through this process. But, just up front, we know there's incredible work happening all over the country. As a former high school teacher, I know that there are amazing teachers all over the country delivering Action Civics, but we are not able to map them. This map is not exhaustive, it's not comprehensive, and it's growing, and we hope that it'll be an iterative relationship between those who are here today with us and those who will continue to do this work. So with that, I'll transition over to Abby, who will maybe speak a little bit about our initial findings as we delved into this coding and this sort of fun process of scanning every single one of your websites and all of our partners and friends.
Thank you, Janet. Hi, everyone. This is Abby from Circle. And what we're going to do is give you a brief overview of some of the kind of broad, what we're calling findings, reflections that Janet and I have on the data. And then we're going to go into some more about the specific methodology. So feel free, as Dana's been saying, to put questions in the chat feature, and some of them we may get to later on. So In terms of the reflections that Janet and I have about kind of having done this in-depth research, there's a few things that we wanted to point out. One is, and Janet's going to go into this a little bit later when she talks about the methods, is we were using people's websites as our sources, as our data sources. And what was interesting about that, because of our knowledge of some programs, we found some disjunctures at times between what we saw on the websites and what we knew about programs. And by disjunctures, I don't mean, misrepresentations. I mean gaps. It seemed as though there was less information online than what we knew about programs. And some of that might be inevitable, but as we think about scaling Action Civics and we think about reaching new audiences and finding new partnerships in different fields, this may be something that we want to look at, and also has implications for how we're talking about the work, how we're promoting the work, and more people finding out about it. The second thing to point out, and is exemplified in this map that you see, and we're going to go into this a little bit later, we have put on this map, this heat map, the places in which programs are largely focused. What this doesn't show are the national programs, right, who have, partners all over the country. But we wanted to show where there is very geographic specific support from organizations in the landscape. So it's a little bit of a proxy in some ways for a local infrastructure. And what you see clearly is that there is a good bit more infrastructure on the coasts and in large cities. And one of the things that we have been thinking about this with respect to this is some of the research that my colleagues, Felicia and Kay, have done recently in thinking about civic deserts, and what implications not having infrastructure might have for young people's opportunity, as well as what Kay and Felicia have been talking about, civic alienation. So as we develop this map out, to what extent can we think about closing some of these gaps to reduce civic alienation among young people? Janet?
Absolutely. So I think the next thing that we wanted to speak about was the context, and this showed up quite frequently. Again, this theme of rhetoric matching action. So, for example, our understanding of the field did show that a particular organization was delivering Action Civics, but when we went to the website, whether because it was out of date or websites are difficult to update, the data was not comprehensive there. Something that we were able to learn about the context of where Action Civics is occurring is that, not just the locations and the heat maps and these the premises of the larger cities and the areas that are within proximity of receiving support, was the fact that the organizations providing those supports are clearly majority nonprofit, 68 out of about 100 organizations. And then the other aspect of context was the fact that, our students are receiving this still in an in and out of school context. So about 40 of those 100 organizations are operating to support schools, which is great since that is the frontline educator that is actually delivering this method and this practice of civic learning. In terms of the goal, something that was interesting, and this was a little more a value statement, and we want to make sure that we're not bringing up false equivalencies. The explicit stated goals on the website were often interesting because when we did the organizational scan, the outcomes were often, not aligned with what was stated. So, for instance, if you said you were interested in empowering students, the outcomes often appeared heavy on knowledge and skills.
Oh, no. I've been there. Okay.
I'm going to pause for a mute. Thank you. So, in terms of the websites and what's explicitly stated, very few organizations mentioned direct outcomes that were related to employment and academic performance. So some of these were the salient themes that came up. So in spite of use of the program, there was the outcomes were still heavily knowledge and skills, which is interesting because the premise of Action Civics is the concept of taking action, and we didn't necessarily see motivation and efficacy as highly as the others.
One of the pieces of information, this is Abby again, and just one of the other reflections that Janet and I had on exposure to opportunity is related to the particular populations that programs focused on. One of the realities was that some information wasn't available in terms of specific, there was some about geography and there was some kind of broadly stated, but there were a lot of places where we weren't able to see, whether there was a specific kind of population that was focused on. From what we could gather, we did see that things that are called Action Civics or that have an Action Civics programmatic component were mostly focused on high school aged youth. There were only 9 examples where we saw this as a focus for elementary school youth. And so that's an interesting kind of thing that we as a field need to think about. The other piece to point out specifically is that roughly 30% or a third of the programs that we categorized, and again, this was not exhaustive, as Janet said, but about 1/3 of the programs that we did include in this so far explicitly had a focus on youth from underserved populations. And we use that word because that was the predominant kind of language that was used to describe programs. And so in this, we included youth of color and low-income youth specifically. So just to review, some of the initial reflections that we have on kind of doing this mapping of Action Civics organizations, as well as organizations that have at least one component of Action Civics, both in and out of schools, are that there's a disjuncture between what's communicated online and some of what we know is happening in the field. That the distribution, there seems to be gaps in the distribution of infrastructure nationally. And when I say infrastructure, and thank you for asking a question about this, I mean the opportunity to build opportunities and resources to build programs. So that there is an organization that does PD that has supportive programming either in a local area or within schools.
And substantial programs that have infrastructure to continue, so they're not a one-off, because impact, which is something we wanted to measure over time, was removed from our initial data scan because we weren't able to collect that data in a clean way just through the websites and what was available through that data. Mm-hmm.
And again, what Janet was saying about context, that this was largely happening via, when, there's some examples, but exceptions, but largely happening with the prompting and pushing and reliance on nonprofits. Half for pushing in school and half pushing out of school. And then the exposure to opportunity, as I was just saying, seems to be very, very focused on high school aged youth. And then finally, as Janet was just going over, that the goals of the programming seem to be heavily focused on knowledge and skills. So and just as a reminder, as you kind of look through the website and the data viz, there is absolutely an opportunity to edit how organizations are categorized. And so Dana is going to remind us about how to do that as we go along.
Should we take a moment to address some of the questions on the sidebar before we jump into the sort of the methods that we used?
Sounds good.
Yep, let's definitely do that. Thank you both for going through some of the initial findings. And if we want to go back to the slide before and let everyone take a look at the overview of the findings again, that might be helpful to prompt some more questions. We do have some questions and comments so far, so I'll read those aloud and we can all take them from there. So the first question is about whether we could distribute the slides. Yes, and also most of this information is on the website as well, so you can find it there and as well as with more detail. Question from Ted McConnell: how does this project relate to the Action Civics initiative led by Aetna and Civic Nation? Either of you want to take that?
Sure. I think Generation Citizen is certainly part of the Action Civics initiative, and Dana, you can speak more to that. But something that we made sure we, were insistent on was making sure that the indicators were aligned with the 4 core program elements that were mentioned. I am certainly not at least interested in reinventing the wheel or rowing in different directions. We're looking at one snapshot of the field, but any area where we can collaborate is an area where we're all successful, and we're very interested in lifting all boats.
Yeah, and I'll just add as well, echoing that we've spoken with Edna about it as well, and we used the components that were identified and by the coalition, and also included the organizations who are members, so that it should hopefully be seamless and represent the group as well. Then we have a couple of comments. So from Sanjeev, a comment saying a third of programs are focusing on youth from underserved populations seems really low. One of the reasons we should focus on this is to change power dynamics. If this is a close estimate, then changing this seems like it should be a priority for the field. Brian Brady says middle schools are great for Action Civics. We should be directing more effort there. And also another question about the 1/3 focus on underserved populations, and is that accurate if you look at scale?
So, Abby, we can talk about a little more of the coding, and we ran it through in terms of values, a vision, mission statement, and oftentimes the little intro tagline is what we called it. Because not every organization has a clean mission, vision, and tagline, again, these were false equivalencies, so we couldn't code these cleanly. So through those value statements, and as we started emerging the themes, and we started moving, youth of low income or underserved youth or high school students who have dropped out of high school, we started coding them into that category. However, it is our belief from our understanding that there are more programs that are focused on underserved populations, but explicitly stated, that is not the case. And obviously there are a lot of problems there when rhetoric doesn't match action, which is, one of the most salient themes of this entire exercise. Abby, do you want to add or elaborate?
Yeah, and I think, Brian, if I'm understanding at least some of where you're trying to go with this question, that one program can reach 300 schools, right? And that's not necessarily represented here. I think that's if this is something that the field really wants to, invest in and think about, then this is, certainly an area of synergy with what Edna is doing to collect, stories from schools and schools that are implementing Action Civics, or communities as we think of both in and out of school opportunities. So what doesn't get captured in that 1/3 is the number of schools. You're absolutely right. It captures programs. And so as we think about how we, talk about our work, that might be something we want to consider. Because one of the things that, Janet, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that was really difficult to gauge based on, looking at an organization's websites was their reach. And so we actually had that as something we wanted to try to pay attention to at the beginning, but the information that was available publicly did not facilitate it.
Yeah, investment and impact were very difficult to measure. So, we're thinking about potentially measuring by staff, but, organizations like ours or the National Constitution Center could carry a staff load, but not that entire staff load is dedicated to Action Civics. So really being, certain that we weren't putting false equivalencies into this data and murking the waters. We believe a lot more is happening. That is probably one of the more positive aspects. And obviously what is available, I think one of the questions coming up is, are we going to be able to update this? And Dana will be able to speak to that more. But in terms of not just individual websites, but overall, I think one of the reasons is the more tech-savvy organizations are much more visual, and there just is not as much information. And then obviously, in terms of resources, it's not cheap to update your website, and we understand that information isn't available in that capacity. And then finally, we think that one of the reasons that organizations aren't surfacing as much information is, frankly, these projects are sensitive, and we're not going to put a project on about that is action civics based, but is dealing with reconciliation between community and police, for instance. That was one example of an organization that does great action civics programming, but it isn't necessarily on their website, and it is not cohesive to their entire portfolio of civic learning.
Great, thanks. And to the question on updating the organizations as some of the information is better reflected on websites, or there are changes to the organization, I'm going to send the link around again now. This is a feedback form, and we'll plan on updating organizations' information every 4 to 6 months and so. And so if you tell us what the change is in this form, there's a space for that for the organization as well as for feedback, and include the link to where this change is reflected on your website, then we'll be making those updates periodically. All right, then going through from Frank Peasy, who's in Sacramento, he says, with our K-12 Action Civics work, we focus on a continuum of service to advocacy across the grade spans. We're seeing that students who engage in this work in younger grades are much more civically aware and engaged in upper grades. We have a question on our definition of action civics, which I will just read again quickly. So we have action civics is a student-centered, project-based approach to civics education that develops the individual skills, knowledge, and dispositions necessary for a 21st century democratic practice. And that's from the National Action Civics Collaborative. And then, oh, you already wrote that there. Thank you, Janet. And then one last question before we dive into the rest of it, and we'll have another Q&A period later, is from Amy Curran, who asked, are you tracking, or is there value in tracking expansion of fields into markets with a variety of political leanings, red versus blue markets?
That's a super interesting question, Amy. We certainly at Circle have the data to be able to layer that on. I guess I think a question for the group is to what extent that's helpful information. And is it about, equity of opportunity, or is it about something else? And I think that there's a lot of different dynamics to discuss there that would be, maybe really helpful for the field to be conscious of.
And I always joke that the word nonpartisan and nonprofit oftentimes have a lot more to do with tax code. So I think, we weren't able to track that from the data that was available on websites. And I think we'd have to have an understanding of the market in terms of the demand for it, because we weren't coding demand. We were simply coding what is in supply. So that is really fascinating, and certainly, if we were looking at a supplier, I suppose we cover a lot of the red market over here.
Okay, Janet, you want to delve into methods?
Yeah, absolutely. So we promise we won't go ad nauseum as to the research process that we went into. Most of it, I would see Abby online working on an Excel spreadsheet that we simply decided we would start coding and compiling information about organizations that were providing action civics, or what we called adjacent. And we compiled about 150 organizations, and we started removing them as they did not, were no longer considered adjacent organizations according to the definitions, the operational definition that we provided, and then also according to indicators that we saw that would ensure that they were working towards providing students this benefit, not just to the field at large or to only, supporters. We did a little bit of a priori coding before we jumped into it. We decided what the categories were, looking at organization types, population served. We were very ambitious about the premise of the organizational vision and mission about statements, but clearly as we were collecting that data and pasting in the visions and missions and seeing that they were not the same data. They were false equivalencies when one organization only had a vision statement. Another had a very clear theory of change drafted out, and others simply had taglines. So it was not as clean. So we went through this a variety of times in terms of the recoding. And with the value statements, the vision, mission, and taglines, we went through and categorized them, into codes such as, these organizations shared, efficacy and voice, or this organization was more focused on, underserved populations. But these are elements that, if we continue to add organizations, would not be as easy to surface. But other elements, we simply started check marking. The organizational outcome mentioned political knowledge and mentioned civic skills. So we would just put a check mark, and later we switched it over to numeric value of 1 so that we could collect the number of organizations that were actually providing the organizational outcome. So we would understand that, 15 of the about 100 organizations, measured academic performance, or 53 measured the civic and political knowledge and civic skills. 47 looked at efficacy and agency. 9 looked at employment-related indicators. 23 looked at civic attitudes and motivations. So changing that in our next round of codes allowed us to get a better quantitative picture from what was initially qualitative. Abby, would you like to add on anything about this laborious process?
I don't. Thanks, Janet.
So in terms of surfacing the themes, we talked about the process of developing the landscape map. We want to make it clear, and we'll get a little shout out later, that we could not have done this without the work of Ryan Old from Civic Studio, who heard us out as we talked about how we wanted to organize these features, changed our minds about the organization types we wanted to measure, and also allowed us to sort of move around, a little more confusing concepts. So an organization could say they serve K through 12, but they have an emphasis on high school. And we wanted to be able to make sure that we were being fair to what was occurring, and not just use the fact that we knew, because we have a relationship with a lot of the organizations, that they serve elementary. We wanted to be fair in terms of the data that's provided. If it says K through 12, we were not certain that they were providing elementary action civics. And similarly, if an organization was certainly focused on underrepresented students, we wanted to ensure that was listed in the data. And then, something that we looked in terms of the features was the goal of our project is not to be exclusive, but instead to be very wide tent. And we added organizations that provided support, and we wanted to ensure that we were listing those who were allies, that this isn't a purity test of this is the only organization that provides high quality action civics, but instead seeing where potential can occur. We were really looking at who's offering this work, and in recognition that these people can support our frontline educators out there. And finally, who gets this work? And I think not just in geography, but in terms of who we claim we serve. And finally, what we claim we're doing, what we are striving to do. And again, not necessarily matching the rhetoric, but we think it's important. Something that could be a non-related takeaway is just the premise of, what we are actually expressing to the public, and our branding and our messaging as the field.
Thanks, Janet. So one of the things that we wanted to try to play out with y'all is some use cases for the map, and for specific audiences. So when we embarked on this, as Janet was talking about earlier, the vision was to try to create a resource for the field as we build. And so when thinking about doing a data visualization, we really needed to think hard about who was going to use it and for what specific purposes and how that supported the work generally. So we want to suggest 3 ideas for that, that the data viz is built around. These, of course, is not an exhaustive list, and we look forward to speaking, with many of you about other uses as well as other opportunities to build in. People have been sharing some really great points for indicators to build into the data that are really exciting. So first, as we think about educators and school leaders, one of the features of the map that we're going to show you is the ability for people to click through to organizations specifically and to their websites. So in some ways, in many ways, this is a portal to the Action Civics community. So educators and school leaders can find resources. They can find organizations that may be focused in their particular geographic area, or programs that focus on specific, components of Action Civics in a really significant way, or the age group that they want to focus on. So in that way, this is a little bit of an indexing of all of the Action Civics related resources for educators, school leaders, teachers to be using. The second use case we want to talk about is related to the Action Civics components. And, the Action Civics initiative that Edna is leading has 4 components. We included a few more because sometimes, people have more components and we want it to be inclusive, as Janet has been saying. So you can look at the differences in, some of the organization's approaches and see where there's overlap, where there are small differences, and to seek partnerships. And an example of thinking about this is as we, think about overlaps with different fields and as we build out this map and this database, we can think about where there's synergies between many Action Civics organizations and some other fields, and whether or not there's some collaboration to be happening with, whole other areas related to youth engagement, youth academic success, youth well-being, where Action Civics can really be seen as a partner. And then finally, thinking about the people who are doing field building, as well as those who are doing funding and grant making, we can use this as a tool to understand where there may be gaps in offering high quality civic learning and offering high quality Action Civics specifically. And some of y'all have already been asking, for example, about rural communities. This is clearly something that the map and the information points out as a necessity to think about and really dwell on as a field. And so that's one example of how this can be used from a real macro level perspective. And the scale question that Brian rose earlier in terms of the reach of organizations and something that other people have brought up relative to thinking about, which schools are choosing to be involved or not choosing to be involved. That is certainly a level of assistance that this map and this database could provide in the future to people who are thinking at that level.
Great, thank you. So I think now we are going to dive into the visualization itself. We will get into it. I'm going to run through some tips on how to use the tool, but also, and we'll do a live demo of it, but invite you to go to the site itself and have it side by side with the webinar if you want to play around and sort of get a feel for it on your own. So the site is there on the slide. It's landscape.generationcitizen.org. As was mentioned, we were able to create it with the thankless work of Civic Studio, who were very graciously helped us to build this and figure out all the nuance and make it possible. So just a few things to note. It's best to be looking at this on a computer. It will work less well on mobile, though possible. As you've seen in some of the images of it, there are both some circles with words in it, and those are all the different features and things that were coded, as well as logos, which represent each of the organizations and their programs. So when you get to the site, if you want to look at a specific program or node, you can pull that over to the side, if you press shift, and it'll glue it in space, and then you'll be able to see some of the highlights over the lines that connected to each of the features. I think that is sort of a good overview to then dive in and do that live demonstration that will be able to explain some of what I just went through.
Okay, great. So Janet, do you want to start
Sure.
to help?
Sure. I think one of the, if you're playing around with this on your own and you've already wandered off because there's so much to do, I think one of the first things we generally do is just uncheck it all, just to make sure that we can decide what we want to look at. And we thought for the purpose of sort of this live demo, we would just pick a couple of features, select an organization type, imagining us in a position of, deciding what information we'd like to learn. And then, select some population served and some outcomes. So, if I were an educator interested in learning what organization offers youth voice, I would click on that and maybe think about, I need to have them do better advocacy and, potentially have some research, supporting them in terms of the organization type. And then, as a high school teacher, I would select high school. I think advocacy as well. And then, obviously with standards and testing, I need them to know a little bit of knowledge and skills. So those are the areas of interest that I'd have. So looking at that, we still have a wide amount of organizations that offer this sort of Action Civics, has a couple of features that we're interested in and, has advocacy and research and serves high school students and meets the needs of knowledge and skills. I think something that is probably more interesting would be trying to understand a little bit more about how these organizations relate to one another. And luckily, there are features on this map that allow us to highlight and show relationships between the individual organizations and what elements and what organization types and what populations we've checked on. So Dana, do you want to walk us through your specific organization?
Yeah, so you'll see that Generation Citizens logo is there a few times because we've got a number of different programs that have Action Civics features. But I think if we can find the GC Democracy Coach logo and then drag that to the side and pin it, so as we discussed, you press shift and then drag it to the side. One moment, please. All right, so you see that pinned to the side, and now we've got youth voice and deliberative discussion and research there as the two features that are clicked. So you can see when you hover over that logo that it shows you which of the click features it has. In this case, it has both of them, and so you can see those lines connected. If you look at a different organization, you may see there are more, there are fewer, depending on what's clicked. And lets you see the number of Action Civics features or other qualities that each of the organizations and programs has.
Great. Any questions from this point before Abby highlights a little bit about her organization?
Looks like the one question is from Brian about adding components to MICVA that MICVA has. Is that possible? And others as well. So again, if I will reshare the link to the feedback form, if you've got specific thoughts about your organization and what is missing from this representation, please fill out the form, specify which of the features that you believe are not reflected, and then point us to the website, where on the website that information can be found, so that we can just make sure that we're using the same methodology for each of the organizations. And we'll make those, we can do a round of updates relatively soon.
Great. Thanks, Dana. So one of the things that you'll see is that the nodes, these circles, only show up when their box is clicked. And that's to make the visual of this easier to understand. And so I clicked on the Allies button, and one of the things to point out about that is that these are primarily people who are not directly running programs themselves. Obviously, there's some exceptions to this, but one example is Circle, who you can see here. And what we're doing to pull out an organization is hitting Shift. Whoops. Is hitting Shift. Sorry. Am I still sharing? No. Ah!
Screen share is gone.
Apologies.
It wouldn't be a webinar without.
Okay. Great. Okay, so what we're doing is picking an organization, hitting Shift, and then it becomes sticky and you can pull it out. And as you click on more of these organizations, it becomes easier to spread out a map and see them and see how they cluster using that function. You can also do the same thing with the nodes specifically. And I find that helpful to see, the different groupings or clusters of organizations. One of the cool pieces of this is that if you double click on an organization, you can go to their website. You can find this page, this profile page for each organization, which has a little bit about them as well as the link. And then you can see how we have categorized them. Obviously, Circle doesn't have a lot of categories because we don't run programs directly for young people. So that's one of the really cool features about the map that we wanted to highlight.
Yeah, I think it's certainly the feature that I spent the most time understanding was, pulling the nodes aside, seeing how many organizations are connected to reform and how many are the limited organizations that are focused on work-based or the coalitions that are available right now that are trying to organize and understand the field. So, have fun pulling those nodes around. One feature that we wanted to add onto this specific landscape map, but it became a little difficult to conceptualize, and luckily Ryan was able to help us out, was this concept of where were students being served? Where is the supply of Action Civic programs? And this is where Ryan came up with the concept of a heat map. And while it isn't perfect in terms of the individual cities and sites and spots, here, which is not surprising in light of the research of civic deserts, are the areas that are being served. And you can see it's the coastlines, and the general area of heat is around the Chicago area, not surprising to those, and a couple of areas in the middle of the country. When you scroll in closer, you can get a better indicator of the actual organization. So in Florida, there are certain different areas and the actual location of where the organization is. What is difficult about this heat map is organizations are often stated explicitly on their website as national in aspiration and scope, but oftentimes the reality, due to limited resources, due to proximity, or due to scaling down their projects, is they're serving a local area, or they have a more specific area that they have access to. So or certain groups are very specific in their charge. They serve the entirety of the state of Illinois, for instance. Those are not as easily represented on the heat map. And similarly, those that have the national charge are not represented. But we were very focused on location and what was available to us on the data that was provided. That if it said we focus on Rhode Island and New Mexico and Texas, then we were able to add that to the heat map. But if it was simply national in scope, it does not affect the heat map and isn't as clearly indicated. However, based on what we know, we are not doing a great job of providing equal access to all of our students at this point, and that much is clear.
Great. So we've got about 10 minutes left and want to make sure that we get to everybody's questions. And if you have any additional, please type them into the chat box. One comment that came up before, and actually the question is from Robert Sherman. Looking at outcomes, these are all individual focused metrics, if I'm reading correctly. How about outcomes of the action? Let's say a policy or procedure change in a school following an Action Civics project. Results that Harry Poit would call public work, not about the individual.
That's absolutely amazing. This is Abby. If we could map that, that would be absolutely incredible. What was very difficult to find, though, on people, the way in which organizations were communicating about themselves was that in particular. And so some of these more academically focused curricula and programs, that wasn't entirely clear from some of them, that impact part of it. The individual student level outcomes was much, much clearer. So if that's what we want to communicate as a group, and I think that some of the out of school programs may do this a little bit better, is think about what we want, what we want to be communicating about this as a field.
Great, thanks. The next one, so people have asked about adding features or new organizations, so please use that feedback document. It's in the chat and we'll send it around afterwards as well. It might take a little bit of time to get that updated, but we will read everything and make sure that everything we make sense to update is updated. There's a question though about teacher-specific websites that complement main websites and whether or not some of other orgs would do that, and if that can be used to as a source to update the information on the map.
I think I'm not sure if this is was addressed clearly in the chat box, but Abby and I certainly ran into circumstances where we were scanning the website, and we certainly would do a thorough search, but if it is buried within 16 clicks of the website, which trust me, I'm not judging, our first iteration of our website was extremely confusing to navigate, it just would not be found. Another difficulty that we ran into was, we would see a program that was an Action Civics-based program, but oftentimes you needed to have a code. You needed to be part of X organization's teacher cohort to get into that website. So clearly, we were not able to, nor were we about to be dishonest and sign up for the program to get access to that. Again, this was not exhaustive. This is, clearly the data that was available, and I think it shows that we have a long stretch in terms of what we are trying to do and what we are communicating to the public at large.
Great. We've got a few more comments. So Ted McConnell says the heat map is misleading. There are several programs working in Omaha, for example, but showing cold profile on the map.
Send them our way. Send them our way. Not exhaustive.
Hewling Lee says, any thoughts on how this can be turned into a wiki of sorts, i.e. allow providers to build on the landscape map? I guess I can take that one and say we can think about it from the tech perspective. That seems like that would be challenging, and that sort of exceeds my personal technical knowledge, but we can talk with our developers and see if there's anything we can do there. All right, from Brian Brady. A lot of us distribute curricula across all the states and train teachers from numerous states at conferences. It is light touch Action Civics, but maybe should be recognized in some fashion too.
I think, what we're really trying to get across here is that Action Civics this is not the only areas where it's taking place. There are thousands of excellent educators in the classroom who have projects that, would qualify by the features as Action Civics. But what we're looking at is what we are able to quantify and, with objective data. Obviously, if we had more time, more funding, more resources, we could do a more thorough and comprehensive research project. But for the purposes of the initial landscape map, something that is objective is looking at what is communicated to the public at large. And I think that is the whole process and finding. Someone asked about, can we learn about the process? We have a little bit of an about the process on the website itself. It doesn't go into it ad nauseum, but certainly happy to speak offline about that as well, Brandon.
And this is Abby, just on Brian's question about having, trained people from all over the country. I think this raises a really interesting question about what does it mean for a community to really, commit to and be prepared to implement Action Civics, and for whom, for what young people in that community. And so what do we as a field, as a result, want to be communicating about there being capacity and infrastructure or readiness in a community? Is, the professional development of, a cohort of teachers the indicator that we want to use? Is there being an organization specifically there to support the development indicator we want to use? That's clearly one of the indicators used in this map and project. But I think that's the question of, training is a good one in terms of, how critical.
We certainly grappled with that as well. Just the premise of, yes, our organizations do have, national impact when we bring together 70 teachers and, have a training, or we are at conferences. But, really thinking about, the supply, as we said, and really moving along what we could measure was important for this first iteration. But, it's interesting because we did have categories in terms of national because, this organization provides support. And I see Sanjeev's question in terms of allies and the too wide of a tent. And, that's certainly something we grappled with as well as we were coding. And ultimately, we were looking at organizations that could be, that were supportive, and their website indicated language that was in support, but also could provide an opportunity to continue to collaborate. If they have a network of teachers who are open to new pedagogy, then that would be an area or an opportunity to continue to build upon the work that is interested in using more updated pedagogy to deliver civic learning.
So thanks everyone for the great questions, and we've got a few more here, and we're coming up at 1 o'clock. Maybe we'll take one or two more and try and address the rest in a follow-up email. We can send an immediate one with the recording so everyone can look back on this and share with colleagues who weren't able to join. And then also a later one with some more details to address the questions. So one of the questions was, where are the definitions of civic skills, dispositions, et cetera, coming from? Are it from the CMS report and other reports?
Yes, I think our definitions of and how we would categorize those align with those in other reports. Janet, would you agree?
Yeah, I think we, not to be too insider baseball here, but I don't think we were too concerned about those specific definitions because we felt we were in agreement from our previous work.
All right, Abby and Janet, any final words from you before we close out here today?
No, just on my end, I think it was a really illuminating project, and I think there is a ton of work to do. For the researchers in the audience right now, you know how time-intensive these continued recommendations are, and we certainly would have loved to have sat down and interviewed every single one of you for 30 minutes or an hour, but time and limitations and costs prevent that. But that's not something that is only a problem with the civic learning field. It's an issue in education at large, but we feel really fortunate to have been able to learn side by side, and we look forward to continuing to learn more about ways that we can collaborate, not just in the Action Civics field, but the field at large. Perhaps one day there will be a map that will show all organizations that have interest in civic engagement and civic renewal and education at large. But here's a little start in our corner of the world, and we're thankful to be part of it.
Yeah, and I just want to say that it's really exciting to be able to show organizations on a map that might not have, the exact same goals in what they're doing in terms of a political ideology, but are using similar means, and to see the, shared resources that there are among them, and to be communicating about how those different strategies and goals create local ecosystems for young people to develop and emerge and have an impact on issues that they care about. So that's one of the things that I'm pretty excited about with respect to this project.
All right, well, thank you so much, everyone. Agreed, it was wonderful to work on, a lot of work for the field ahead, but really exciting that we've made so much progress. We want to give a special thank you to the Ford Foundation and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for their support for this project. I'd like to thank Ryan Wald of Civic Studio for creating this wonderful tool for us, and to Janet and Abby for all of their work and leadership throughout this project and ongoing. And we will share the recording of this webinar along with that feedback form that was shared in the chat. We will do our best to address the outstanding questions. And you can find additional information about the whole process, as has been mentioned, on the About page on the website. So again, the website is landscape.generationscitizen.org. There's a feedback form is also there, as well as more information. Thank you, everyone, for joining today, and have a great afternoon.